Today, we call someone a genius as if they belong to a category that separates them from others, that who they are, how they are, and what they do is simply untouchable, not because they necessarily have applied themselves and others haven't, but because they are special in some way. They are more talented, they are smarter by conventional standards, and say touched by the gods. When we think of genius, we are more likely to think of genius as a compliment, as a kind of elitism, spiritual specialness, and social hierarchy that suggests that some people have been by nature determined to be better and superior to others in that wise, that genius is rare and bordered by some form of predetermined exceptionality, or maybe it's a gene. And you can almost think that the word genius was intentionally created to define and constantly remind us of the gap that exists between they and them, to create that separation between the so-called exceptional few and the rest of the collective. Now, here's where this gets really interesting. The word genius does not begin that way. It wasn't about intellectual superiority or rare talent at all. In fact, the original meaning was profoundly spiritual in nature. The word genius shares roots with words like genesis, generate, which means to produce, to bring forth, or to beget, to birth. At the very foundation of that word was the reality of what the Romans referred to as a guardian spirit everyone possessed, or a daemon. It wasn't about hierarchy or elitism. It wasn't about a kind of exceptionality. It was more about who was more aligned and could collaborate more with this guardian spirit. Genius in this wise was never about being more than others. It was never about being better than others, but being true to yourself and bound to an irreducible essence that only you carried. It was all about collaborating enough with this guardian spirit to be able to express its nature at the highest level possible. So your genius was the source of your generative power, your creative life force, the divine spark that sort of animates your ability to create, to function, and to bring forth new life in all its forms. Now, the word genius was never about externality, what we know, how we define genius currently, because externality was simply a form that gave credence to genius mastery. So, for example, a female could always bear a child, but can't necessarily bear one at, let's say, 2 years or 3 years old. However, as she matures and she grows into puberty, all things being equal, say there are no biological hiccups and anything like that, she could bear one if she so desires. Bearing that child does not make her a woman. It simply creates a form through her as a woman, which is mother. And so, in the same way, the expression of genius isn't genius. It isn't the definition. It isn't the border. It's the form that is produced based on necessary alignment. So the woman bearing a child does not become more essentially woman because motherhood is simply one possible expression of her womanhood. And so we've been culturally conditioned to get this backwards, to see externality as the determinant of genius, when genius is what makes the external possible in the first place. Is the reason why we tend to experience imposter syndrome. We compare ourselves with others. We are competing where it's not even necessary, because we look to the externality as a definition of genius, and it isn't. It's only the expression. So here's the question that I would assume you're asking. How did a word that once named our essence, that once named the animating force in each and every one of us, become a word that fences us out? How did genius go from universal to elitist? How did genius go from spiritual to mundane? Now let's backtrack, because it has its foundation in religion, early Christianity to be precise. And I think even though it isn't so rampant on some level, we still see this today among some religious circles. So it was simply the idea that the concept of a guardian spirit, A, gives people a sense of agency where they don't need God, and B, may be interacting with pagan or demonic spirits. So the idea was to keep God sovereign by creating this parity between self and spirit, where genius is seen as something bestowed on you, and not even necessarily in the sense that it was already given to you, but that it existed externally and not within you, that it's some kind of calling, or some kind of spiritual exceptionality. Now, in organized religion, three things are necessary. And one is external authority, which is the need of the church to access God. Then hierarchical mediation, which is leveraging priests, spiritual leaders, and prophets to get closer to God in that sense. And earned worthiness, where you have to strive, you have to suffer, and you have to prove yourself to earn anything, right? Think about it as the whole concept of going to the wilderness to accept the glory. Now, fundamentally, this was in a bid to guard humans and exert some kind of control over how they acted, over how they functioned. It also created a contradiction in the idea of the animated spirit that was breathed into man by God according to Genesis. And as it evolved, it also contradicted the gospel of Christ, which thankfully we are currently growing in and is not the case today. So at that time, the whole idea of genius as a guardian spirit was closely linked and instead transferred to the idea and the concept of angels, demons, and all of that. So Christianity came in to sort of ensure that people are not, quote unquote, giving host to alien spirits, because that was what it was considered as. Now, moving on, there was another shift where genius was attempted to be explained and flattened to unique natural endowment. It was the classic, trying to explain what was deemed supernatural or otherworldly or spiritual as natural, while totally eliminating the spiritual element. So genius became just about brain chemistry and individual talent. And what's even interesting is there's been studies done on brains of supposed geniuses to find, something specific or definitive that could have culminated in their being and expression. And nothing tangible was actually found. Anyway, now in modern times, the concept of genius is also flattened to IQ and measurable outcomes. It's flattened to a kind of result that is celebrated. It looks like form with popularity, but without substance or depth. So genius is mostly measured in what is seen, not what really is. And this is where the challenges that I believe that we experience on an individual, a systemic, and even a collective level stems from. Because instead of seeing how largely disconnected that we've become, we start to nurture damaging competitiveness where the game is already rigged against you. We function as victims of our own reality instead of masters of design. We do not see how the very form we are competing within blinds us to the possibility of what we could own. So we are constantly reactive instead of generative. So when we see someone that we recognize as genius, rather than seeing a person who consciously or unconsciously got out of the way of their conditioning enough to let their essential nature flow more freely, what we see instead is the difference. We see the obvious gap between vision and reality, the disparity between potential and standard. And so instead of recognizing, oh, that's what humans look like when they're not blocking their genius, we say that person has something special that I don't have. And we keep striving to succeed within an idea that was designed for your failure anyway. The idea of genius was programmed into us wrong, so we crave validation, acceptance, and recognition because we've been led to believe that externality is the definition when the definition is genius, because the world never validates, accepts, or recognizes you if you haven't done so first. And the reality is, if you need the world to validate, accept, or recognize you before you recognize yourself as who you are, you may not see that recognition. And even if you do see it, it may not have any meaning to you. So genius is the irreducible essence of who you are. It's the signature of your soul and the energy of your potential. It's the weight of your person that insists on expression constantly. Genius is spirit. It's essential material. It isn't first form. It simply cascades into form based on seasonal necessity. And seasonal necessity is simply bordered by enlightenment. The more you grow in enlightenment, the more you come into new seasons. It is why genius is mastered progressively. And yeah, in another video, I would share with you 6 cardinals for genius mastery. So genius is mastered progressively. And so it's also why the framework that I created, the Genius Arc, which is basically a navigational map for human potential to help you evolve into your highest expression. They are not really stages, they're cyclical. You keep moving through the arc. You keep going through it based on your level of enlightenment. So you are genius, or whenever I say you are genius, whenever I refer to you as genius, whenever I say unlocking genius, recognize that it isn't a compliment, it is who you are. It is code, and the weight of the life, the leadership, and the result that you seek is on the bed of mastering your own genius.